Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today, checking out this new album from Jethro Tull, Curious Ruminant. There's a bunch of links down below. You got links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlist that I put together every week, and the Patreon page. So make sure you check all that out. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So the band just released their 24th album, Curious Ruminant, on March 7th. This is the follow-up to 2023's Rock Flute, which was an album that I was very critical of when it was released. I had some kind of, I shouldn't say high expectations for Rock Flute, because the album that came out before that, which was the Zealot, which is the band's first album in 22 years, I wasn't really blown away by. I thought it was an okay album. So I was kind of expecting more of the same on Rock Flute. And while I would, rank the Zealot as an okay album, I would rank Rock Flute near the bottom in Jethro Tull's catalog. I think I had it listed as one of my most disappointing albums of 2023. So because of that, I decided to kind of hold off. I wasn't going to pre-order the new album. I was going to wait to listen to it before I decided if I was going to grab a copy of it. And for a band that was pretty consistent throughout their career, starting in the beginning in 1968, all the way through to 1999, they released albums at least pretty semi-regularly. And then they went on this big 23-year gap between JTull.com and the Zealot Gene, where Ian Anderson was working on solo projects. He did release several solo albums, but there wasn't a Jethro Tull project in there. So after that period, once the Zealot Gene came out, so now we've had 3 albums in the last 4 calendar years. And I guess to be completely honest, I consider myself a Jethro Tull fan, but I've always been more a fan of their 60s and 70s albums than anything that they released in the 80s and on. So when they released the Zealot Gene in 2022, I thought it was an okay album, which I think is good for a band that's 50 plus years into their career, and a band that I consider really only making one really great album since the end of the 70s, which was Roots to Branches in 1995. I thought Rock Flute was a big step backwards from the Zealot Gene because, I get it. Rock Flute was originally intended to be like a fully instrumental album, but it lacks some of the heart that the band had on the Zealot Gene. When Jethro Tull was at their creative peak in the 60s and 70s, the band was more of a collaborative effort. And then really starting with A in 1980, which I get it was supposed to be an Ian Anderson solo album, but it was packaged and sold as a Jethro Tull album. Really from that album on, it was no longer a collaborative effort. And on a lot of those classic Jethro Tull albums, the flute was just another instrument in the band. And then really starting from A on, it became the main focal point musically. And I think that's really kind of what shifted my interest in their music. And also by the time that they created A, Jethro Tull had already lost most of the members that they'd had in the 60s and 70s. At that point, it was really just Ian Anderson and Martin Barre. And while the band would have some success in the 80s and 90s, they never would reach the peak that they did in the 60s and 70s. So musically, the new album sounds, I think, a lot more akin to the Zealot Gene over Rock Flute, because a lot of these songs were older tracks, older instrumental tracks that have been reworked for this new album. So if you look at the Zealot Gene, Rock Flute, and Curious Ruminant as almost like a trilogy of those 3 albums, this is easily the longest. There's 9 tracks on here, coming in at over 51 minutes. And musically and lyrically, I think they try to do something a little different on Curious Ruminant than they did on Rock Flute, where Rock Flute had this very strict theme. It was really tied to Norse mythology, whereas Curious Ruminant sounds almost more like a compilation album. I mean, there's still some really strong introspective and personal themes throughout the album, but it's more so like a collection of songs rather than, like I said, with Rock Flute, that's really strict theme. So even though these songs aren't musically tied together like they were on Rock Flute, I think there's a better flow to the album overall. And after being very consistent throughout the first 40 plus years of the band, really only having 2 guitarists, this is the 3rd straight album where they've got somebody new, which is Jack Clark replacing Joe Parrish, who played on the last album, which I don't remember who he replaced on the Zealot Gene. But I think with Jack Clark, I think the band finally found a guitarist that has more of a similar sound to what Martin Barre was doing in the 70s. And I think it gives this album more of a almost familiar feel. Also, when they were releasing those classic albums in the 60s and 70s, Jethro Tull, when they were at the peak, had this more, there was some grit to their music, there was some roughness to their music. And really, since the 80s, they've lost all that. At least, I mean, there were hints of that on some of those 80s and 90s albums, but really since then, I mean, these last three albums, they're all very polished. They really have lost a lot of that roughness that they previously had. So the first time through the album, I really only had one track that I thought was a really skippable track. Like, I completely do without this one. And it was really disappointing because I felt like it was the one track that I had a lot of hope for. And that's the almost 17-minute long Drink from the Same Well. So with that song, I really thought that the band would kind of dip their toes back into some of that more progginess that they had in the 70s on, say, like on Thick as a Brick, because I think that's what gave Jethro Tull some of the greatness that they had in the middle part of the 70s. And really what I came across, or after listening to that song, what I thought about it was more like almost like cartoonish, over-the-top kind of like Renaissance fair, almost like a Renaissance fair elevator music kind of sound, which was my one huge criticism of Rock Flute. So it's really kind of sad to see a song that I think had promise, that they could have done a lot with, and really kind of fall into the same pitfalls that I think they did on Rock Flute. Overall, I just think it's kind of a boring song, and I could really do without it. A song I initially had as, that I considered maybe a skippable track is the last song on the album, Interim Sleep. I think what saves this song is it's really short. It's like just over 2 minutes long, but it's this like spoken word song over what sounds almost like, I guess the best way I can describe it is music that you'd hear on a sleep app. And for a rock album, that's a description you do not want for one of your tracks. And the one thing I always talk about in these reviews are track listing and track sequencing. I feel like they did a good job with the beginning part of this album. I feel like the album really starts off with some of its stronger tracks, and then you get down to the end of the album, and I think it really kind of goes out on a whimper. But the album opens with the track Puppet and the Puppet Master, which I think is probably one of the best songs on this album. I love the piano intro that it has. It really sets a tone for the album, but the album kind of, like I said, it kind of starts off really strong and then kind of gets weaker as you go through it. The song Curious Ruminant, I think, is another really strong track on here. It has this almost, I think it's one of the heavier guitar songs on the album. And it has this almost like almost minstrel in the gallery sound to it, which is probably why I think it's one of the better tracks. It was also the perfect pick to be the lead single on this album because that's kind of my first thought. My first opinion I based on this album was hearing that track. And I thought it was a really good single. I thought the single was better than anything I heard off of Rock Flute. So I was having some maybe more higher expectations for this album than I initially had. But kind of going through the album, like I said, I feel like it kind of falls in a lot of the same pitfalls that Rock Flute did. And another track that I know I'll listen to multiple times is the song Over Jerusalem. I think it's one of the stronger tracks on here. And this is another one of those tracks where I think if they did more of that on this album, I would have a better overall opinion of it. Over Jethro Tull's 55-year plus career, I think one of the steepest declines that they've had are the lyrics. Because lyrically, that's what the band was known for, really, in the 70s. Was that funny, kind of witty lyrics. And as the decades have gone on, I feel like they've lost a lot of that. And a lot of it has gotten kind of weird, just kind of boring. There's not a whole lot going on there. Even though you could hear glimpses of it in the lyrics across the album. I could probably do without a lot of lyrics on it, which is something that's really sad for a band, like I said, that has had some great lyrics across their career. And I think Ian Anderson does a really good job with the production on this album. He has produced, I think, every Jethro Tull album since the very beginning. At least he's either produced or co-produced the album. I don't have any complaints with this one. I mean, yes, it does have like a overly slick presentation at times on this album, which I think is kind of another thing that's a little disappointing about it because Ian Anderson produced all those classic albums in the 70s, so he knows how to have that same production style. But, yes, production has changed over the years. It's evolved over the years. And I just kind of wish you would have a little bit more of that same sound that they did previously. But the album's not overly compressed. There's not any, like, over-the-top effects on here. Sonically, it's a good sounding album. But vocally, Ian Anderson just doesn't have it anymore. Yes, I think he's, 77 years old. So, he's had a long career. But as a fan of the band, it's hard to hear that decline over the decades. And I think Curious Ruminant is an album that I think would have benefited with having some outside collaboration, bringing somebody else in, have another set of ears in there. You know, even though Ian Anderson's going to do what Ian Anderson wants to do, I think having some new ideas, bringing in some new sounds, I think would have added to the overall feel of this album. Because it sounds like they're just kind of retreading the same songs and the same ideas album after album now. So as you would expect, I wasn't blown away by this album. I think the work of Jack Clark on here is really great. I think he has a lot of promise as a guitarist. I think there's promise in some of these songs that just kind of didn't work out the way I wanted them to. But overall, the best I can give the score is probably, I think a 4.5 out of 10 is a good score from me, because, you know, Rock Flute, I'd probably give a 1 out of 10. It was that bad of an album, even though I'm probably in the minority of Jethro Tull fans. I know a lot of Jethro Tull fans absolutely love that album, and I'm sure they're going to love Curious Ruminant. But as somebody that, you know, time and time again, I keep saying I'm a fan of their 60s and 70s music, I'm always going to compare their albums now to what they did previously. And I know they're never going to be able to reach those peaks that they did before, but I would love to hear more than just a glimpse here or there of it. So one question I always ask in these reviews is this an album that I would buy a physical copy of? I'm not going to say no. I'm not going to say yes either, but I guess, you know, it's not a really expensive album. I think you pick up a copy of the standard black version of it for like $26-27. If I could find it somewhere for maybe $20, maybe $22, I might consider picking up a copy of it, just because I have most of their albums already. But this is not an album that I definitely have to have a physical copy of. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what you guys think of this new album, Curious Ruminant by Jethro Tull. It's not all bad. You know, I do have some positives in there. I think those 3 songs I named, which was what the title track, Over Jerusalem, and Puppet and the Puppet Master, I think those are 3 really good, really strong tracks, especially for a band that's, you know, 55 plus years in their career. But let me know what you guys think. Like always, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure to give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.